I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a second so you can see my face a little bit. My name is Jacob Martinez. I'm a ACT therapist and trainer. I'm an LPC working in Kenosha, Wisconsin, as Asel said. I'm heavily involved in the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science community. I'm currently on their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committee. And so excited to talk to you today about intakes using the ACT matrix. And so let me bring up the slides again. And we'll get started because we've got a lot to cover, and it's a topic that I could talk about endlessly. So we're going to be using the chat function for a few different, well, actually one large demonstration later on. So make sure that you got your chat settings set so you can send a message to everybody, not just the panelists or whatever, so everybody can kind of see that, because we're going to make extensive use of that in the middle of this presentation. So don't be shy asking questions or comments in the chat. So I'm here to talk to you today about intakes and the ACT matrix. ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, though what we'll be learning today is just a method for introducing some basic concepts, setting goals, and establishing a therapeutic alignment. You do not need to work from an ACT approach to benefit from this training, and you do not need to know anything about ACT to understand the content of this training. And you don't have to do anything ACT related after this training is done either. Although if you do know something about ACT or you do practice ACT, you will recognize a lot here today. So this training is kind of sectioned off into three parts. First, we're going to talk about like what even is an intake session. Why do we do them from our perspective as the clinician, but also from the client's perspective? What is the benefit of a really well-conducted intake session? And then we're going to demonstrate the ACT matrix activity. And this is actually an intake method or an intake protocol that I've developed over the past 5 years. We're going to take a look at that together, and we're going to see how it can accomplish everything that we need it to do for an intake. And then I'll talk to you about how to seamlessly transition into the rest of the work with the client. So like after you do this intake session, setting yourself up for success for session 2 and 3 and 4, and so on. And at the end, I'm sure there'll be some time for questions and comments and maybe some troubleshooting as well if you work with special populations, for example. All right, so we all do intakes with our clients, and we all do them differently. Not only am I a therapist, but I'm also a client. I've seen a few different therapists myself over the past many years. Each one of them has done the initial session completely differently. And I've worked at a few different agencies and nonprofits and different private practices and so forth over my career. And again, the intake process has been different for each of these locations. So knowing that everybody does intakes differently, we want to hone in on, what is the underlying purpose of an intake session? Are there any commonalities that we can decipher between all of these different methods? And the way that I do that is by asking, what are we trying to get out of the intake session as clinicians? And what does the client need to get out of an intake session? The intake session must be purposeful for both us and the client and evenly weighted. Meaning the intake should not just be mostly for my benefit as a clinician, nor should it be mostly for my client's benefit. We should both achieve something, and hopefully achieve something in a collaborative way. An example of an intake that is overly weighted to the clinician's end would be one where the entire first session is spent with the client doing assessments or answering questions from a battery that the clinician is reading from. Now, I've encountered this kind of intake as a client, where the first meeting with this therapist, all we're doing is she's checking off boxes and answering questions, and I didn't go back because I didn't feel like we made a connection in that first session, and it also didn't feel like we really did anything. It was just kind of an assessment. An example of an intake that is overly weighted to the client's end would be one where there's no structure or process at all, at least not a structure that is perceivable to the client. That would be something like the client sits down and just starts talking with no direction from the therapist. I've also experienced this kind of intake as a client, and it was a little bit too freeform for me. I kind of want some direction when I seek therapy. So we really want to tailor the intake session to best accommodate the needs of both the clinician and the client. So what are those needs? Broadly, an intake session should have these 5 goals. 1, we want to set the stage of the therapeutic process and environment, acknowledging that the therapeutic environment is different from other environments that the client may be familiar with. Essentially, here we're talking about what are the rules of the space that I'm in? Is this the kind of place where I can put my feet up on the couch, literally and metaphorically? Everything that the client encounters for the first time informs this, from the decoration and layout of your office, to how you dress, to how you sit in a chair, and so on. Basically, at the onset of therapy, we are sending signals that say, this is the vibe of this space, and this is what is or what is not allowed or expected here. So that means we want the initial encounter to be one that sets expectations, that this is the place where we can do the kind of work that is necessary. Now, depending on the kind of therapy that you do and the populations you work with, that message is going to be different. But I do think it is worth paying some attention to how your office presents itself, how you present yourself in those first initial contacts, and whether or not they align with the kind of overall theme or values of the kind of work that you're aiming to do. The second thing is we want to establish clear treatment goals that are workable for both you and the client. Treatment goals that are created during this initial phase of treatment should be evenly weighted again. So they should take into account the clinician's needs, but also the client's needs. There's no sense in making treatment goals that are only useful or understandable to you as the clinician. And on the other hand, there's no use in agreeing to treatment goals that the client dictates completely. Because as we will see later on in this presentation, clients' goals are often unclear or unattainable, or they're driven entirely by the very presenting issue that they're seeking treatment for. So treatment goals must be collaboratively created between the clinician and the client in such a way that they're easy to understand and act upon by the client. And they also should fulfill any requirements that the clinician may have. For example, using behaviorally focused goals. The third thing is we want the intake session to orient the client to the style, approach, and modality of treatment that you as a clinician use. And so there's no sense in doing an intake session or a series of history-taking sessions, and then at some later point in time, shifting gears into a different style of work. Rather, we want to fully integrate the approach into the very earliest moments of the therapeutic encounter, so that the client gets a taste of what the work looks like, how it feels, and can make a more informed decision about their treatment sooner rather than later. The fourth thing that we want is we want to get some history from the client about what's happening in their life. But, and I cannot stress this enough, we are not trying to take a complete and extensive history of our client's life in this initial session. I once knew a clinician who had a very extensive history-taking process that stretched out for 4 to 6 sessions. That's too long. Our goal during the intake is to simply take a sufficient history of the client in a way that is functional for you as the clinician. And we'll talk about that more later on here in just a bit. And lastly, we want the intake session, what we want the intake session to do rather is have the client leave hopeful that change can take place and confident that this is the space where that change can occur. Therefore, the client will be more willing to return to the next session and come ready to do the work that needs to be done. So those there are the 5 main goals of any intake session. You might think about your current intake style and see how what you do covers these 5 goals. And at the end of this presentation, I'll discuss some like special circumstances and how to stay true to what we're aiming for here, even if you work in an environment that you don't control, like a state-run agency, for example. So establishing the context of the therapeutic process begins at the earliest contact between you and your client. Keep in mind that clients can only come in 3 varieties. 1, clients who have never been in therapy before and have no frame of reference whatsoever. They have 0 idea of what to expect. They don't know what therapy looks like. They don't know what therapy is about, or maybe even what therapy is for. 2, clients who have never been in therapy before, but have seen therapy on TV and movies. And that's their only frame of reference. So they come in with some idea of what to expect, but only this kind of maybe cartoon version of what therapy actually is. And 3, clients who have been in therapy before with somebody else who works differently than you do. So any of these 3 clients is not going to walk into your room knowing what to expect. It is our job as clinicians to help clients know what to expect from us and what to expect from the therapeutic encounter. To do this, I've created a spiel or several spiels that I use with every client no matter what. And these spiels are always the same. I can say them in my sleep at this point. And each of these spiels is designed to preview what's about to happen. So here's my introductory spiel. Actually, if you receive the slides at home, I made some last minute adjustments. I think I just switched around a couple of slides and I maybe added one. I'll get the final version out to y'all. The intake spiel looks like this. Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Jacob. You can call me Jacob. I've looked over your paperwork and everything looks great. Thank you very much for filling that out for me. So typically when I meet with people for the first time, we do 3 main things. First, we'll get a chance to talk more about what you've been going through lately and what you've been noticing in your life. Then, at a certain point, we'll start to sort everything you've been talking about into a kind of framework that I use. It's mostly for me, but it'll help us focus our work together moving forward. And sometimes my clients also find it very useful in their own lives. And then the last thing we'll do is go over odds and ends. We'll talk about scheduling, what future sessions might look like, stuff like that. Does that sound okay? So that's my spiel there, and you can kind of take that and adapt it if you'd like. Clients always say, yes to this. Like when that last little piece where you say, does that sound okay? They always say yes. So that little introductory spiel that I do, that's like when our butts hit the seat. So as soon as we walk into the room, we kind of, greet each other, sit down, and that's the first thing that comes out of my mouth. No client has ever been like, no, I don't want to do this. Let me just talk about something else. Clients kind of want you to lead them along and say, okay, well, here's the rough kind of game plan for today. And I think the reason that clients mostly want that is because if you notice, every other time you've been to any kind of professional's office, like a doctor or something, they have a spiel that they use. And the spiel is something very similar to this, where they kind of lead you down a path. After you do this introductory spiel, then I just prompt them to tell me why they're seeking therapy at this time. And so that introductory part now leads us into the history taking phase of the intake. Here we are aiming for a functional contextual interview to learn more about what our clients have been going through. We focus not just on info about what they've been struggling with, when and where, but also how they've been attempting to handle that struggle, the costs of those strategies, and any benefits. During this interview, you want to ask questions that probe for context and function. So see if you can draw out not just how the client is feeling, but what they do in response to their experience and how those actions work for them. This period of history taking does not always need to be long. A lot can be accomplished in a short amount of time if you are asking questions that point to function. Keep in mind that no matter how long you have with a client, you would never be able to cover their entire history. So the aim isn't to know every detail, but rather to get a broad picture of what the client is struggling with, particularly in a recent time frame. Throughout the interview, we're also trying to uncover the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences embedded in the client's story. So that just means like antecedents are what happened just before a behavior or just before something happened. And then consequences are what happened after a behavior or after an action. My history taking portion of the intake lasts only about 15 to 20 minutes. I tend to take a much briefer history than other clinicians I know, but I make up for it during the next step that we're going to talk about, which is the ACT matrix itself. If you're looking for a good method of doing a functional contextual interview with a client, I recommend the work of Kirk Strozal and his book, Brief Interventions for Radical Change, which goes into depth on this topic. And if you Google Kirk Strozal contextual interview template, you'll find some material that lays out like a history-taking method that is very brief, but covers a lot of bases. You might find like a PDF file of that. And Kirk is an ACT clinician, and he works in the field of like ultra brief therapeutic contexts, settings where you might only have 15 to 20 minutes to talk to a client total. So his work is very useful for shortening your history taking process. Okay. So once I take the history, a sufficient history, we begin to shift into the ACT matrix. Now, there's no exact time as to when this shift should occur, but there are some kind of general guidelines that I use. First, it's just like once the client has told me roughly why they are seeking therapy and some of the details of their experience, they might start to say it in a way that starts to kind of put the pieces together the way that the ACT matrix is going to do for them in the first place. So if I kind of see the client kind of headed in the direction, I'll I'll say, you know what, here might be a good place to shift into that framework that I was talking about. Now, of course, if you're taking this training right now, you may or may not be familiar with the ACT matrix in advance, but that's fine because we're about to do it together. And so you'll know exactly how to set it up right after this presentation, and you should be able to do it with any client that you meet moving forward. So before we dive into the matrix itself, what I also want to say is we want to let the clients know that this is happening. Like, so we're taking the history, and then once I hit that point where I'm saying to myself, okay, now we should switch to the matrix, I want to let the client know that. So what I typically say is, you know, now would actually be a great time to start to sort what we've been talking about into the framework that I mentioned before. And again, this is typically after 15 to 20 minutes of the client talking about why they're there. Clients will not protest this shift. You know, I've done intakes like this with every single client that I've ever seen for the past 5 years. And not once has anybody said, no, I'm not ready to move on yet. The second thing that you want to keep in mind is you want to give yourself enough time to do this next portion of the intake. You will need no less than 30 minutes to set up the matrix and complete the rest of the intake. So if you look at the clock and you only have 15 minutes left in the session, do not try to cram what we're about to do into that 15 minutes. I can guarantee you that it will not work, and I can guarantee you from my own experience that it will not work. If you are running out of time, simply extend the functional interview to fill up the rest of that time and complete this next step, which would be the matrix, in the following session. So let the client know that you would not like to rush through the framework that you mentioned earlier, and that you would like to begin with that framework at the start of the next session. And then briefly, before we get into the matrix, let's talk about time a little bit more. For most of my career, I've tended to do like a standard length session as my intake. Although I know a lot of clinicians do a longer intake session, 90 minutes or even 2 hours. That's fantastic. If you do intakes that are longer like that, you should have adequate time to do everything that you're learning here today. So you shouldn't even have to worry about running out of time. I also know clinicians that do 45-minute intakes, and that is not enough time to do what we're about to demonstrate, because the matrix just by itself takes at least 30 minutes. So if you do a 50 or 60-minute session, you just have to be very mindful of the time left. And it's always best to save something for the following session rather than rush it and get kind of sloppy with it. So let's move on to seeing what the ACT matrix looks like in action. For this section, I will lead y'all through the matrix, all of y'all at once, kind of like as a group. So I'll need you to participate through the chat box. You'll also need a piece of paper and something to write with on your end if you want to follow along. And I do highly recommend that you follow along so you can kind of experience how it feels to do this method. Typically, when I'm working with clients, I would do this on a sheet of paper that I have on a clipboard, and my client also has a clipboard with a sheet of paper. But of course, nowadays, everything's over the screen, so I use the computer screen to draw. So what I would like y'all to do is go ahead and take a second to get some paper and a pen, and I'm gonna set up my side so I can draw on the screen for y'all. All right, guys. Let's see if you can get into the chat here. Can everybody see this happy face that's on the screen? Just making sure that this screen is functioning the way that I need it to. So just type in yes if you can see that. Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. All righty, guys. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to lead y'all all through the matrix as if it's the first time you've ever been exposed to it. So you may already know a little bit about it, and that's okay. If you don't know anything about it, it's perfect. And I'm just going to be kind of moving along as if I'm talking to a client. But I'm going to be writing down, bits and pieces of all the chat into this diagram. So the way that I set it up is I hand the client a clipboard with a piece of paper, and I have one on my end. And I let the client know, what we're about to do right now is we're going to start to sort out some of the stuff we've been talking about today into a sort of diagram. But don't worry, you don't need any art skills at all. It's super simple. Just follow along with me. And if you're using a standard sheet of paper, I do mine landscape style rather than portrait style. So the first thing that I would like y'all to do on your piece of paper is just draw a straight line down the middle with an arrow on each end, just like this. And if you've got the arrow on each end there, what I want you to do next is see if you could just draw the letter T on one side. I usually do it on the right-hand side of the arrow, and the letter A on the other side. The letter T here is going to stand for the word toward, like moving toward something. The letter A is going to stand for the word away, like moving away from something. So if you've got that on your page, what I'd like you to do next is I want you to see if you can imagine a rabbit, like a bunny rabbit that you would see outside. If you can imagine a rabbit, you can probably also imagine that there are certain things that a rabbit would like to move towards or get closer to, and certain things that a rabbit would want to move away from. What is something that a rabbit would want to move toward, for example? Type that into the chat box. Clover, carrots, garden, food. Excellent. Yeah, that's right. All of those things a rabbit would want to move toward. What about away? What are some things that a rabbit would want to move away from? Dogs, predators, other animals, strangers, a fox, a hunter. Excellent, right? Really, really simple concept. Nothing complicated about that. And even though we're doing this on a sheet of paper, which is two-dimensional, this is actually a three-dimensional concept. Because you can imagine a rabbit running away from a fox and toward food or a garden or carrots at the same time. So it's not one or the other. It can be both depending on the context. Well, it turns out that you and I and everybody else in the whole world, we're a lot like rabbits. The only real difference between us and a rabbit is that we have like a little bit of a bigger brain than a rabbit does. But with that extra brain space comes what I like to think of as two different worlds that we have to balance. What I mean by that is rabbits mostly have this kind of external physical world that they live in. They care about actual carrots that they can eat, actual gardens that they can go visit. They care about actual predators that might hurt them. You could take out your phone and you could show a picture of a carrot to a rabbit, and it wouldn't care about that at all. You could show a video of a fox or a wolf to a rabbit, and maybe it'll run away for a second, but as soon as it realizes it's not real, it's fine again. But you and I, because we're human beings, we can see a picture or watch a video or get a text message, or something can happen to us, and we can kind of get hung up on it all day long. Or a week later, we can still be thinking about it. Or 20 years later, we can still be thinking about that thing that happened to us. That's because, just like rabbits, we have this outside physical world that we live in. We move toward things in real life. Sometimes it's actual food and carrots. We move away from things. Sometimes it's actual predators or dogs that are chasing us. But we also have this internal world, which is full of thoughts and feelings and memories and stuff like that. And the external world and this internal world, they kind of feed back on one another, which creates its own set of complications for us. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later. For now, let's go back to our diagram. The next step that I would like you to do is just draw a horizontal line right down the center of the page so that you make 4 quadrants or 4 boxes. Now that we have 4 boxes here, I'm going to ask you 4 questions, 1 question for each box. And all I'd like you to do is just jot down your answers in the box. You don't have to write the question down. You don't have to write complete sentences even. You can put a single word in there if you want. Just whatever comes to mind when I ask you the question. Just jot that down in the box. And then when you're finished, you're going to share those with me. So I'm not going to read your page. So you don't need to worry about your handwriting or whether or not I can understand it. As long as you understand it, that's fine. Let's start down in the bottom right-hand quadrant. That should be the toward side. So if you did yours at home there backwards, you're looking for the lower toward quadrant, this one right here. The question for this box is, who and what are important to you in your life? So those of you participating right now, I want you to write those on your matrix at home on the piece of paper, and then I want you to type it in the chat box as well afterwards. Who and what are important to you? This can be people, can be places, it can be things. It can be things that aren't physical, like qualities or concepts or ideas or values that are important to you. Anything at all. Just, if it comes to mind, go ahead and add it to that box. No right or wrong answers. Take your time with that, and then add those to the chat box as you're finished. And I'm going to start writing a couple of your answers. So we got family, dogs, compassion, friends, nature. Ooh, travel, that's a good one. Put that one in there. Excellent. Wonderful. So I'm going to stop there because I'm out of room on mine, but y'all can keep going if you'd like. Here at this point, if I was working with an actual client who I could talk to and was sitting in front of me, I would take some time to kind of break down each of these items that they've listed. So I might just inquire more, tell me more about your family, tell me more about your dogs. What is it about them that is so important to you? What are those relationships like? Compassion. Does that mean experiencing compassion from others or being a compassionate person? And so all I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out like what is involved in each of these items so that I can know more about my client. And so this is why my history taking process is a little bit shorter than the average clinicians, is because I can boost it when I'm doing the ACT matrix. I get a lot of their history through this portion of the intake. And again, if you're doing an hour and a half or 2 hour long intake, you can really take your time exploring some of these things in each of the quadrants. If you're doing a shorter intake session, sometimes you don't have much time, but you can do that in subsequent sessions. So let's go back to the matrix here. What I'd like to do next is let's move over here to this box. That should be the bottom away side box. The question for this box is, what are some of the things that can show up on the inside of you, like thoughts, feelings, memories, stuff like that, that can get in the way of these things down here, or get in the way of connecting to these things as much as you would like to? Again, what are some of the things that can show up on the inside, like thoughts, feelings, memories, anything like that, that can get in the way of who and what are important to you, or get in the way of connecting to who and what are important to you as much as you would like to? Go ahead and write those things down in your matrix at home. And when you are ready, type those into the chat. Wonderful. Got some great ones here. Pain, anxiety, financial hardship, conflict, resentment, trauma, judgment, self-doubt, depression, fear, being disengaged and worry, miscommunication, guilt, working too much, prioritizing balance, or prioritizing and balance in life is off. Wonderful. So as your client is doing these, you're just kind of doing what I'm doing right now, is just encouraging, like, as they're telling you their items, you're saying, excellent, great job, noticing these things showing up in your life. No matter what they put, there's no right or wrong answers. So now we're going to swing up here to this box. And again, before I swing up there, if I was working with a client face-to-face right now, I would take some time to explore each of these items that they listed. Because two things tend to happen, just depending on the kind of client you're working with. Sometimes the things they list in that bottom left-hand quadrant are all of the things that they've been talking about during that history-taking session, that first part. And sometimes the stuff they put down here is stuff that they did not mention at all during that history-taking portion. So you take some time just to explore, what does that anxiety look like? The judgment, what kind of judgments are there? The doubts, tell me more, depression, and so on. So we're just kind of building that out and taking as much time as we need to do that, but being mindful of, how much time we have left on the clock. Once you've gotten to that point, then you say, okay, now let's swing up here to this top box, because these two boxes are connected. The question for up here, this top box, is, let's say that there are times when this stuff down here is just really, really strong and it's really influencing you. You feel really wrapped up in the anxiety and the judgments and the doubts and the depression and the fear. When this stuff down here is really hooking you or really influencing you, what do you end up doing on the outside in terms of your actions or behavior when you're really under the influence of this stuff down here? So that's the top left quadrant, the away top quadrant. What are some things that you do on the outside in terms of your actions when you are really under the influence of those things that showed up down here? The anxiety, judgment, doubt, depression, and so on. So go ahead again and write those in your matrix at home. And then when you're ready, type them into the chat box here. So we got a few. Become disengaged, worry. Become irritable. Isolate. Withdraw. Avoid. Become frustrated. Distract. Yeah, for sure. Wonderful. Overthink, use a substance. Those are great ones. I don't have enough room to write all those excellent things that you all have noticed. So again, no matter what the client brings up, we welcome it and we write it down on our matrix. So to kind of go back, the client has a sheet of paper on their end and the clinician has a sheet of paper on your end. I'm not writing my own matrix, my own answers of my personal stuff. I'm copying down what the client is telling me, just in the same way that I'm copying down what y'all are telling me, so that at the end of the session, I can have a copy and the client can go home with their own handwritten copy. So anything that the client says, just welcome it and write it down on your side. And then, of course, you can take some time to explore each of these items, just as I've been saying. Tell me what it looks like to be detached. How do you know when you're irritable? Can other people tell? In what way do you isolate, and so forth. So you're just drawing more of that functional contextual information out of the client. And then once you've explored that for a little bit, you kind of swing it down like this. And I draw these arrows very vividly for the client on my page. I say, before we move on, let's swing back down here for a second. After you've become detached, after you've done those things that happen when you're irritable, after you've isolated and withdrawn and distracted yourself, what shows up on the inside for you in terms of thoughts or feelings? So I want y'all to think about that. After you do those things up in the top left, what shows up on the inside for you in terms of thoughts and feelings? And you can write those in the chat box. If you've got some extra room on your page, you can add them to the bottom away quadrant as well. Loneliness, frustration, more of the same. Guilt, worthlessness, anger. Bitterness, blame, self-pity. Excellent job. And so we can add those to that bottom away quadrant. And then the question just is, when those things show up, the loneliness and frustration and guilt and the worthlessness and the anger and that bitterness, when those are showing up and those are really, you're really wrapped up in those things, what do you tend to do on the outside? And you can see maybe it's some of the same behaviors, maybe it's some different behaviors that show up on the outside. So what do you think when you're all wrapped up in that guilt and worthlessness, anger, bitterness, blame, self-pity? What do you tend to do on the outside? Lash out, avoid being present. Excellent. Try to connect with somebody, move, walk, do something for somebody else, clean a house, work out. Excellent. So y'all are picking up on something here. Sometimes our thoughts and feelings show up on the inside. We do something on the outside, essentially in response to those thoughts and feelings. But that first set of things that we tend to do is not always the most workable set of things. After that, more experience shows up on the inside of us, and it could be more intense or more the same or different, a different set of really uncomfortable stuff. And then after that one, we either do more unworkable stuff or we start to do things that are different, start to do things that kind of actually maybe start to pull us out of it a little bit, depending. Now, clients that you see may just get caught up in a loop. The most loops I've ever done with a client of back and forth, top and bottom, has been 8, where it's been a different set of experiences and a different set of behaviors each time. The average client, you'll go around and do maybe 2 loops or 1.5 or so, and you'll just say it's the same. It's just a cycle, right? This stuff shows up on the inside. I do these things on the outside. More of that same stuff shows up. I do more of these same actions back and forth, back and forth. So at this point, I've highlighted this loop on the page for my client, and I ask them, does this look familiar to you? And they say, yes, that's me. That's my life. And at this point, I say, what you're seeing here, we call it a loop or a stuck loop. Basically, the stuff shows up on the inside. It's uncomfortable or difficult to hold on to. We do things on the outside, in theory, to get away from that stuff. But when we do those things, more stuff shows up on the inside that is very difficult or hard to hold on to. This loop, this kind of stuck loop, every human being on Earth gets caught up in a stuck loop from time to time. Some people's loops last, hours or days. Some people's loops last months, years. Being stuck in a loop like this is actually the most human thing that could ever exist. Rabbits, they don't do this. They don't get caught up in these loops. Only we do. And that's because we have this very sophisticated internal world that we have, and this very complex external world that we live in. Excellent. So I kind of give him a little bit about that loop, and I'm basically just kind of humanizing it a little bit. I'm adding some compassion there. And then I say, we're going to take a longer look at this moving forward. For now, let's just kind of leave it and let's move over to the final box that we have, just so we can complete this diagram and round it out. So let's come over here to this box. The question for this box is, what are some of the things that you might do or currently do that would definitely move you toward who and what are important to you? What are some things that you could do, or maybe that you are doing currently, that definitely move you toward who and what are important to you? See if you can write those on your matrix at home, and then add it to the chat. Being creative, quality time with others, setting boundaries. Yeah. Connect with people over Zoom. Call or text anyone in my bubble to go on a walk or just connect. Wonderful. And we'll do some troubleshooting section after this, just to kind of see, because not every client can kind of just come up with some of these things. Sometimes they don't know what to put there, and that's okay. And I'll explain kind of what I do in those situations. But for now, we got a great list here. Create new things, spend time with others, try to connect over the internet, Zoom, or texting, share more heartfelt things instead of shallow talk, and maybe look inward and introspect a little bit. Wonderful. So now that the 4 boxes are complete, the next step is I ask the client to look at their matrix, and I say, over the past 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, or however long they've said that these difficulties have been prevalent for them, on which side of the matrix have they been living their life the majority of the time? The away side or the toward side? Now, 9 times out of 10, the clients are going to say the away side is where I've been living. I've been stuck. And we simply say, yes, you've been stuck. I can see it. And look here, that loop that looks like a vortex, that vicious cycle, that's that visual representation of that stuckness. It makes sense that you'd be stuck if you're feeling all these things that are so hard to feel. And all you're trying to do is just make it easier on you. But at the same time, it's not working very well. It's at this point that we really hammer in the therapeutic alliance. After the client has the matrix filled up to this point, I say to them, let's say that you and I could work together here in this room. Just talk for an hour, maybe 1 hour a week. Would it be okay if we made it the goal of meeting here once a week for an hour just to talk? Would it be okay if we made the goal of doing that to be learning new and different ways of handling this stuff down here when it shows up, and at the same time moving in this direction? Is that something we could use this time and this space for? Now, at this point, clients will give you one of those full-bodied yeses, like they'll not just with their head nodding, but like every single part of their body will say, yes, that's what I want to do. And you say, excellent, let's do it. And I'll get into kind of why that's important of setting goals in this way, or at least that one big broad like therapeutic contract. Like, we're going to use this time and space for this purpose. And then we're going to set concrete goals later on, but that therapeutic alliance has now been set. Never has a client, in any of my experience, said no to that proposition. Nobody's ever said, no, I don't want to do that here. Every single one, even if they've come in with a different kind of agenda, has agreed to this kind of contract, this way of working. So once they agree to this way of working, I say, awesome, I think you and I can do some really great work together. And part of the way we're going to do that is we're going to use this system as a sort of map to help us get where you want to go. And we're going to use this map a few different ways. One of the first ways we're going to use this map is just like a language thing. This is a toward and away system. This is not a good versus bad system. This is not a right versus wrong system. This is just toward and away. Any of the stuff that shows up here in the top away side, we'll call these things away moves. These are things that we do that are designed in theory to help us move away from this stuff down here. But as we've hinted at before, the things that we do up here actually don't do a good job of moving us away from this stuff on the inside. In fact, most of the time when we do those things, more of this stuff shows up, which leads us to more of these things up here. And it's interesting to note that even though all these things up here in the top away side, they're trying to get us to move away from this uncomfortable inner experience, but what they're accidentally doing is moving us away from who and what matters to us. So we can kind of say pretty confidently that a lot of these away moves here aren't working for us very well. So part of our job then, of working together might be figuring out different away moves that we might be able to do that are more functional for us, that actually do help us move away from the dog and towards the carrot at the same time, and don't disconnect us from the people and things that are most important to us. Anything up here on the top right-hand side, the toward side, we'll call these toward moves. A toward move is anything that moves you toward what matters to you. It can look like anything at all. So we're not trying to turn you into a perfect, only do toward moves machine and never do away moves. We want to be able to do both when it's appropriate to do both, or when it's appropriate to do each. Let's go back to our rabbit for a second. What would happen to a rabbit that only ever moved away from dogs, but it never moved toward food or carrots? Type that in the chat. What would happen to a dog that only ever moved away from predators, but it never moved toward food? It wouldn't survive, it would starve. Chris says it would be a corpse. That's right. It would starve, and it would starve exhausted. And what would happen to a rabbit that only ever moved toward carrots, but it never moved away from dogs? What do you think? You would be in danger. You would have a dead rabbit. You would have, Sandra says, you'd have a fat rabbit as a meal for a dog. That's right, it wouldn't end well. So you can see here that too much of either end is actually problematic. So we're not trying to do only toward moves and never do away moves. We're trying to get to a place where you can do a little bit of each depending on the context. So you can move away from dogs when you need to move away from dogs, and so you can move toward carrots when you need to move toward carrots, and to know the difference between those two things. So that's kind of like the language of toward and away, of how it might be helpful for us here in this session. Instead of talking about how things might be, bad or wrong, or good and right, we can look at them in terms of what is this moving me toward? What is this moving me away from? Another way we can use this as a map is throughout our work together, we can kind of reference it. So for example, now that we've agreed that this is kind of what we want to do together, every single time we meet, we're going to be laser focused on this one goal of helping you find new and different ways of handling all that stuff that shows up on the inside of you and moving toward the things that matter to you. So that means throughout our work, perhaps we're having a session, I might slow you down or pause you and say, hey, you know what? The last 10 minutes we've been talking, I don't feel like it's actually moving us in any direction. Can we go back to our matrix and take a look and see if we're still on the right track or if we need to adjust things a little bit? Another way that this can be useful for us is like this. Here, let me pick up my pen so I can draw on the screen again. What would happen if every time we met, all we ever did was sit down and talk about these things down here, the part of the matrix that you can see? What would happen if all we ever did was sit down and talk about this stuff down here in the bottom away side quadrant? Go ahead and type that in the chat. What would happen if every hour we met, all we did was sit down and talk about that stuff, and we didn't talk about anything else? Stuck. We'd be stagnant. Megan says we'd be hyper-focused on the things that are not working for us. We wouldn't be thinking about anything else. We'd be rehearsing the negative. Circling the drain, marinating on going nowhere. I like the way you said that, Chris. Excellent. So we're not going to do that, because that's not what therapy is about, right? This isn't a place where we just come and just talk about our worst problems and nothing else. You see, you're bigger than just this box. Your life contains so many other things. And since we identified a lot of this stuff that's really, really important to you, we can kind of use this to harness ourselves onto. We can latch ourselves onto these things that are so important to you to help us kind of pull ourselves out of this space and into the kind of life that we want to have. Now, throughout our time working together, I'm going to ask you to track or do certain things outside of this room for obvious reasons. If all we ever do is talk about stuff in here, we never do anything differently out there, well, nothing's going to change out there. So that'll actually start today. I have a little assignment for you, which I'll explain here in just a second. But before we do that, I'm wondering if we can do one last thing with this matrix. One last thing. So y'all at home, if you have space on your page, what I would like you to do is just draw a big circle right here in the center, connecting all 4 boxes. And if you've got that there at the center, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Type the questions in the chat, and then at the end, we'll write something in the circle. I'm sorry, type your answers in the chat, and at the end, we'll write something in the circle. So the first question is, for you in your life, who is the person who gets to choose who and what are important to you? For you as a person, who gets to choose who and what are important to you? Go ahead and type that in the chat. Me. You do. That's right. And for you as a person, who's the only one that can notice all that stuff that shows up on the inside of you? And who's the only person that can actually respond to it on the inside, even when nobody else around you knows that anything is going on? Even when nobody else around you can tell that you're experiencing all that stuff? Who's the person that can notice and respond to those things that show up on the inside? That's right, it's you. And luckily for you in your life, who's the only person that is in charge of your hands and your feet and your voice and your body and your energy and your time? You. So what I'd like you to do is just write a big me there right in the center of your circle. You see that there's a you there at the center of your life. Only you get to decide who and what are important to you. Only you can experience all those things that you've been experiencing. And only you are in charge of your hands, your feet, your time, your energy, and how you spend your time. You see, we actually have much more control over our lives than we tend to think that we do. Especially when we're caught up in one of these stuck loops. When we're caught up in a loop like this, our life tends to shrink down around us, and things get smaller and smaller and smaller until we feel like there's nothing else at all except for this pain. But actually, we have a lot more control than we think. So part of our work together is going to be finding different ways of tapping back in to this level of control that we have. This big me that's at the center of my own life, that can make choices for myself, that can experience the things that nobody else can experience, and that can choose what's important to me. So that's another way that we're going to use this method in our work together. Now, before we move on, I just want to get a sense of like, what was it like to lay your life out in this way that we just did? How did that feel to do, and what do you think about that? That's a question that I ask my clients, but I'm also asking it to you at home. What was it like to kind of lay your life out in this manner? Just type that into the chat box for me. Chris says it was a way to hold it and finally navigate it somehow. Hope. Reinforcing, clarifying, insightful, non-threatening, eye-opening. It brought some honest insight. Megan says, I feel empowered. So are you seeing it? This is what we want to do with clients, for clients. This concludes the matrix here. The only thing that I do next is I give them a homework assignment. And the homework assignment is very simple. I say, you're going to take home that sheet that you just did. I'm going to keep mine. You take yours home so you can reference it. And all I want you to do between now and next time we see each other is, I want you to see if you can mentally kind of track or keep keep note of the away moves that you do and the toward moves that you do. Now, all day long, as soon as we wake up, we start making away moves and toward moves in our life. Remember, toward moves are anything that we do that moves us toward what matters to us. Away moves are anything that we do that are designed simply to move us away from discomfort or something that is hard to hold on to. So anything could be an away move or a toward move. Here's an example. After this session, I'm going to go eat some lunch. Or in this case, after this training, I'm going to go home and eat some dinner. But I'm an adult. I can eat whatever I want for dinner. Nobody's in charge of me, right? I'm in charge of my hands, my feet, my mouth. So I could go home tonight and I could eat 16 donuts if I want to. But eating 16 donuts might be a toward move or an away move, depending on what's important to me. Let's say, for example, that I wasn't a therapist. Let's say I was an actor and I was trying to gain a lot of weight for a role. 16 donuts for dinner might be a toward move for me in that context. Now, let's say I was an actor and I was trying to lose a lot of weight for a role. 16 donuts, well, that might be an away move for me at that point. So you see, it's not the donuts that decide what is a toward move or an away move. It's not the donuts, it's you that decides what is a toward move or an away move. So all I want you to do is just mentally kind of just notice. So you might be living your life, just going about your day, and you might think to yourself, oh wait, this is one of those toward moves we talked about. Or, oh wait, this is one of those away moves we talked about. Is that something you think you can do? Client says yes. Now, sometimes they say, do I need to write them down? You can say, if you want to write them down, you can. You don't have to. You just have to kind of mentally track them. So it's okay if you just have it in your head. It's fine. If you feel like it would be helpful for you to write them down, please do so. And then we can take a look at them next time we meet. In fact, we wrap up by saying, this is how we're going to start next session. So next time you come back, as soon as we sit down, I'll say, last time we met, we set up this system of toward and away. And I asked you to see if you could track these toward moves and away moves. And then I'll just ask you what you noticed for yourself. There is how we conclude this whole matrix process. Once we're finished with this, time is almost done with the session. So then I'll move into odds and ends, scheduling, procedure, stuff like that. And then we say goodbye. And since I've been working this way, what I can tell you is clients always come back. I think it's kind of a universal experience of being a therapist. You have clients who come to see you once for the intake and then they never show up again. And it happens to me. And I've been the client that has done it to other therapists myself. But since I started working in this way, that number of clients who has not returned after that initial session has reduced drastically. I think actually last year, 2020, I had 0 clients not return. And I think the year before that, I had 1 client not return. So if you're kind of seeing a pattern in your own work where the clients are coming for 1 session and they don't come back ever again and you don't understand why, it may be because something along these like 5 steps of these 5 targets of an intake session, somewhere in there something's not quite right. And if you notice, I said that there were 5 targets for an intake session, and I covered 2 before the matrix: history taking and establishing the therapeutic context. The rest are built into the matrix here. So that would be therapeutic goal setting, treatment planning can be done through the matrix, and so forth. And we're actually going to switch back to the slides so we can take a look at that. So let me switch this thing. Excellent. So in your slides, I have inserted some of the spiels that I used throughout this process, but I'm also going to give you, I have them on my website. So you can just kind of read them there as well. I'll give that to you at the end. So it's just exactly what I say during the setup of the matrix process. So we're just going to skip through a couple of these since we just did all this. So let's take a look at some of these core elements of the ACT matrix. The first thing we do is we establish this metaphor of toward and away, and we use the rabbit metaphor to reinforce that. The rabbit metaphor is like the standard way of establishing the toward and away distinction. You can use other animals if you'd like, but my recommendation is you keep it consistent. So for example, there was a time when I was asking clients, like, do you have a pet at home? And then I would use whatever pet that they have, whatever animal that they have, because all animals do this toward and away thing, including us as humans. But the problem that I ran into that is now you have to keep track of whose animal belongs to who, right? Like you have to know that you use the dog for this one and then their parakeet for this other client and so forth. And it starts to get just too much to keep track of. And it's always easier just to talk about the rabbit. So you can always just say, well, remember our rabbit that we talked about in the first session? Like you can always go back to it. When I train clinicians on the matrix, which I do extensively, because all I talk about is the matrix, sometimes they'll say, like, is the whole setup important? You know, is the whole setup of the rabbit, like, because it's kind of long, you know, is it really important to do all of that? And I've experimented with shortening it down and stuff like that, and I haven't been able to get it any shorter than it is. But I keep the rabbit metaphor in it because of feedback from clients. I've had many clients say to me in session that outside of session at home, they were about to do something problematic or unworkable. They were about to do something, and then they said, oh, damn, that stupid rabbit. So they'll come to me and say, oh, that stupid rabbit, I remember that like right at the last second. And then I did this other thing instead, which is a more adaptive or workable behavior. So the rabbit metaphor, I do encourage its use. It really sticks in the client's mind. And it just so happens that rabbits exist on every continent in the world, I think, maybe except for Antarctica, but every culture is familiar with a rabbit. So it's kind of clean in that way. If you've noticed here through the matrix work, the matrix does this really cool thing where it sets the groundwork for what is unworkable and what is workable. And it sets the groundwork of this idea that trying to control your feelings in the way that you're doing them isn't working for you. And in ACT, we call this creative hopelessness. And so what we're doing with the matrix is we're drawing out some of the client's values, you know, what they really care about, so that in future work, we can always set everything against or up against their values. You know, we can talk about how what they're doing or what they're thinking about is connected in some way to those people and things that they care about. So it really just opens all these wonderful doors for future work all the way down the line with clients. So the matrix itself is like a miniature functional analysis or a functional assessment, meaning we're looking at how your behavior is functioning for you. And then some of these are ACT terms, but there's this term here of self as context. In ACT, there's this concept that you are your body and more, and you are your mind and more, and you are your behaviors and more. And you're not just any one of those things. So clients can come to us and they kind of think like, oh, I'm this thing. I'm a depressed person, or I'm an anxious person, or I have this disorder, and that's just me. And what we're doing here with the matrix is we're saying, actually, you're like a very complex system that exists as a human being, full of all kinds of stuff. So with the ACT matrix, we kind of set up collaborative treatment goals. So I didn't do it specifically here in this presentation, but in that top right-hand quadrant, the top toward side, what you want to do is you want to start to kind of shape behaviorally focused goals or behaviorally focused items for that list. So for example, clients might say, well, I need to stop being sad all the time in that top right-hand quadrant, or I need to just do this. But what our job is to do is to hone those down and say, well, if you weren't sad all the time, what are some things that you can see yourself doing? We want to be behaviorally focused here. So things you can do with your hands, your feet, and your face. Hands, feet, and face. That's what we want all goals to have. So you can help the client kind of tailor that top right quadrant stuff. So when they say, I can try to spend more time with people. Well, spending more time with people is kind of vague. Specifically, who? What would you be doing? How would you be doing it? When would you be doing it? How often? So we just want to go through and set some kind of like SMART goals. So specific, measurable, attainable, time sensitive or time limited. And we want those things to be contextually aware. You know, we don't want to put anything in that top box that can't possibly be done, you know, something that's just, it's not feasible. So once you have goals like that, your treatment goals sort of write themselves, especially if you work in a context where you need to write down like specific treatment goals for clients, like actionable items. You can just pull those right out of the matrix and right onto your treatment planning sheet that you need to give to your boss or whatever. And then after that initial session, you're just following up with homework of tracking those towards and away moves. And then you're just going along with the work. You're seeing like, how did that work for you? You know, what was the function of this? And then you're just shaping skills, whatever skills that the client, you know, needs in that moment. People kind of ask me sometimes too, like, what about diagnosing clients? Because I didn't mention that at all. But the matrix is a great way to help you as an assessment tool for diagnosis. So through the matrix, you're looking at stuff that's showing up on the inside, how the client is responding to that stuff on the outside, which gets you halfway there to any DSM diagnosis, right? So you can use it in the background of your own work to help you think about, like, you know, what is the best diagnostic category that this might fit in, that this client's life fits in. You can also just use it to assess clients' progress throughout the therapeutic journey. So you might think of things like, you know, from week to week, which of the quadrants or which of the squares is primarily dominating the client's life? Are they totally focused on the bottom left square? Are they totally focused on the bottom right square? Are they totally focused on actions that they do? And then so on and so forth. So I just love the matrix because it gives you that consistency of sessions. You know, you can always go back to it and say, you know, I feel like we're getting lost here in our work together. You know, the things we started out doing, we're not really doing those anymore. Do we need to reassess? So I'm gonna kind of go through some of these things, and then we're gonna wrap up for today and do questions and answers or any kind of troubleshooting. One last little note: as you're doing work with clients, you might find that they know exactly what they need to be doing. In other words, they have a good awareness of that toward and away, but they have difficulty like actually just doing it. So for example, they might say, I know what I need to do, I just can't do it. in cases like this, we want to take a look at the vertical line of the matrix. The vertical line is not explicitly set up in my intake protocol, but the vertical line is the distinction between our internal experience and our external experience. So our thoughts, feelings, memories, and stuff versus our actions. So what that means is when clients get stuck on the horizontal line, we want to shift to the vertical line in helping them become more mindful of the stuff that's showing up on the inside of them and more mindful of what they're actually doing on the outside physically and how that feels to do. We can also get stuck with clients if we as clinicians are focusing too much on any one of those quadrants and we're ignoring the other quadrants. We want the work to kind of flow between all the components of the matrix. And so here's just a sample matrix of somebody that I worked with for a demo for one of my trainings. And this is a person, you know, had never done a matrix before, but it would look like this. So let's say, for example, let's do some troubleshooting real quick. Let's say that you have a client who has no idea what they could be doing that would move them toward what matters to them. So that means that top right-hand quadrant, they don't have anything to put. Well, they'll let you know, and I'll say, you know, that's totally fine. For now, why don't we just put a question mark in that box? So we just put a big question mark in that box. I usually just do a huge question mark, fill up the entire thing. And then at the end of the matrix process, when I say, would it be okay if we set the goal of working together to be, I'll say, learning new and different ways of handling the stuff down here, the stress, feeling tired, putting things off, and at the same time, clarifying and finding out what could we be doing up here in the top right that would move me toward who and what matters. So experimenting with new actions. And that always works. So that's what you would do in that kind of situation. So some further troubleshooting. Let's say that you work in an agency setting or something like that, and you don't have complete control over what you can do in an intake session. So for example, you know, it's sort of the thing where you always have to do this thing in the beginning of a treatment. My recommendation is do whatever you need to do. Like if your boss says you got to do this thing always on session 1, do that thing. It's fine. And then what you might do is in session 2, do the intake the way I described it here. And you would just add a piece of kind of explanation in session 1. You would say, session 1 is going to look a lot different than session 2 is. In session 1, all we're basically going to be doing is doing some assessments. We're going to do a couple different things. It's just what we got to do, just because that's just the rules. So we'll knock that out, and then next time we meet, I'm gonna really take my time to talk with you more, and do a little framework with you that I like to use that's going to help us set goals for working together moving forward. Something like that. What I can tell you, though, is I've worked in agency settings. I've worked in state-run facilities. I've worked for nonprofits. And if I've worked there long enough, I've been able to, on my own, integrate the matrix in some fashion into that initial session. It's just a matter of knowing the rhythm of your own work and knowing how much time it takes you to do certain things, and then kind of squeezing this in wherever you can. The matrix has been used all over the place. I didn't give you the history of the matrix because it's not really important. You can read about, you know, who invented it and stuff like that. I've got all the references here in the back. let's take some time, perhaps the last 25 minutes or so, and let's see if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to share. And you can do that either through the chat box, or if you would like to use your voice, you can just indicate so, and we can ask questions that way as well. But I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and any questions that you might have. If anything wasn't clear, for example, you can ask me to show you something again, anything you like. The floor is yours. Wonderful. Chris has a question here. What do you do when the client feels hopeless about the upper right quadrant due to the restrictions that they perceive about their environment and existential conditions, finances, etc.? Yeah. So Chris, for that question, if somebody's feeling really hopeless about the upper right quadrant, my thinking is you're just trying, the aim of the matrix is really trying to bolster curiosity. So for example, in my experience of working with many, many clients, I've actually never encountered that example that you're talking about of somebody who feels absolutely hopeless that things cannot change due to whatever, because the entire run-up of the matrix, like talking about who and what is important to them, what gets in the way of what's important to them, and so on, tends to kind of loosen up. We call it psychological flexibility. It tends to kind of begin that process of psychological flexibility right away, so that by the time we end on that upper right-hand quadrant, it's never like, no, nothing's going to work, it's all bad. And it's more like, I'm not sure what works. In which case, that's where we want the client to be, in a state of kind of like, I don't know what would work for me in my life, because that's a state of curiosity almost. And from there, we can say, well, you and I can really make it a point to experiment and track and see how things are going. Well, let me take a couple more questions. I don't know if that sufficiently answered yours, but what I can say is I haven't really encountered that situation. If we do the matrix the way that I kind of laid it out, it's designed to sidestep that very thing. Yeah. So even a similar question by Kelly, high hopelessness about living in a rural area. In other words, lack of access to certain resources and so forth. Well, in situations like that, so for example, these do exist. You almost want to think about these situations as if, what would I do if my client was in prison? And talk about a lack of access, limited resources. If you were living in a box and you could never get out of that box, but you had to, what could you possibly do that still connected you to something that was important or something that mattered to you? And so in that case, the work becomes much more small, much more focused on the intrapersonal. Like, small, tiny, mindful actions or ways of seeing the world that are slightly different than what the client is currently doing. And sometimes that can help kind of loosen things up a little bit. In other words, like if it was just me on Earth and nobody else existed, maybe that would be a terrible existence, but also maybe I could find a way of being that really supported myself, a way of even carrying my body, for example, a way of sitting, and trying to take it from that approach, and then one step at a time, widening out that circle. So widening out the boundaries little by little, and then integrating any person who is in that box with them. We have a question here from Mary, and what do you find is the average number of sessions you have with a client using ACT? I tend to do short-term work. So it's very rare that I work with a client for like long periods of time, years, or even a year. I really do try to work, in terms of seeing a client for 6, 7, 8 sessions, something like that, maybe 10 to 15 sessions. And towards the end of that, we're already weaning off. So we might do 4 sessions in 4 weeks, and then start to space it out every other week. And then maybe just do once a month check-ins. And then maybe if they want to continue and do more long-term work, we just check in once a month kind of a thing. But I do tend to do shorter term work. There is a book in the references for this training written by Benji Schoendorf and Kevin Polk. And Benji Schoendorf has created like a 6-session protocol using the ACT matrix. And it's roughly 6 sessions. You can do each section on one session, or you can kind of meter it out over longer time, but it's basically 6 steps. And so that's a 6-session protocol that he uses to great effect. He really enjoys that. He's another clinician, and he seems to really enjoy that kind of working. So that book will have how to do that 6-session approach. As for acceptance and commitment therapy as a whole, this training specifically, we can't go too deep into that, but the ACT matrix is sort of, you can think of it as like a branch or a fork of ACT. It in and of itself is like a complete way of doing ACT. There are some clinicians that do the matrix from intake to termination, and that's just how they work. They don't do anything else. There are some clinicians that integrate the matrix as a part of their other ACT work that they do. And then there are other tools in ACT, like the choice point and things like that, that people prefer to use rather than the matrix. But if you're coming from a traditional ACT point of view, and if you are familiar with the hexaflex or the hexagon model of ACT, what you can do is some people just kind of overlay the hexaflex right onto the matrix. And you can literally just draw it right on top of the matrix, and you'll see that it lines up almost perfectly. And there's people that have written on that topic and have maybe done little videos on that. I don't do that, but I have written about it. So, for example, if you look at the bottom right-hand quadrant, the toward side, those are the beginnings of values work in ACT. On the bottom left-hand side, the away side, that is where you would do cognitive diffusion and experiential acceptance work. On the top of the matrix is when you're talking about committed actions and analyzing the function of behavior. The vertical line of the matrix is talking about like contact with the present moment. Can you be in contact with what you care about, what matters to you? Can you be in flexible contact with the stuff that shows up that's very hard to hold on to? And then the center point of the matrix, that me in the middle, represents like that self as context. And then the function of doing the matrix itself is the self as process. So ACT, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's 6 processes. All 6 processes can be done through the matrix. And the matrix has been used for a variety of different conditions and diagnoses in different fields. There's a study recently that used it for teachers and teachers' mental health. It's used widely overseas. There's a group that uses it in Sierra Leone for gender-based violence, because there's a high rate of spousal abuse and so forth over there. It's used a lot by business executives and stuff like that to hold meetings. But if you want to learn more about the matrix and how to use it for a variety of applications, I would point you to my own website. My website is theactmatrix.com. And I've written extensively about the matrix there and how to use the matrix in a variety of different ways. And I also write in that website, there's a page that I have about the hexaflex and the matrix and how to approach those. You're also free to email me anytime, because I love talking about this stuff, so I can talk about it forever. But if you're looking to find more, what I'd like you to do is go to that website, just read all about it. I actually have in that website a written form of the entire intake protocol that I did with y'all today. So like you could go to the website and you can just read from top to bottom all of those spiels that I use, all of the method that I use when introducing the matrix for the very first time. It's basically this entire training that we just did, but in written form, so you can kind of reference it and tailor it to your own needs. So let's address Megan's question. Megan has a question. It's, what do we do when people are ambivalent about change and they start to blame others for not being able to meet their goals? And how do you address relational concerns? Well, part of ongoing matrix work is we want to address how the client is relating to themselves, their own stuff, like their own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And then also thinking about how is a client relating to others around them interpersonally. So if a client is ambivalent about change, that indicates that you really want to hammer in that idea of the stuck loop. So the matrix is set up in a very particular way that sidesteps a lot of these difficulties from ever happening in the first place. Because when clients really see that loop, that stuck loop on the away side, they really start to think, oh, geez, all these things that I've been doing and the ways that I've been being with other people, maybe they're not working for me as much as I think that they're working for me. So we would try to draw out the function of the behavior through the matrix and really just visually highlight, like, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this stuff? And if they're okay with it, then that's fine. I mean, why are they in your room? Why are they doing counseling? So you might have to re-clarify goals at that point. But always I would just be pointing my finger towards the function and saying, are you aware that this loop is happening? And how does that feel to be in that loop? And if you're in this loop, is it costing you anything? Is there time that you're losing? Is there relationships that you're losing with people? Let's say that you're working with somebody maybe multiple people, like a family or a couple, you would have each person do a matrix. So I would lead everybody through the matrix just like this, and we would share, everybody would share who and what's important, what shows up on the inside, the patterns of behavior and so forth. And then it's a matter of like seeing what commonalities does everybody's matrix have? Like, is there certain things that are important to everybody here in this room? Are there certain behaviors that everybody here does? Can we take ownership of that and so forth? So there's a lot of ways to use it and adapt it. Oh, Kelly, great question. Do you think this could work for clients of all ages, including older children and adolescents? Yes. So I use this matrix with everybody. I work with adolescents right now, but I used to work with young children. So believe it or not, I've successfully done a matrix with 6-year-olds, with children as young as 6, and that's probably the limit, is 6 years old. There are a few different ways that you can adapt the matrix for younger children. And if you search ACT matrix with kids, you'll find some stuff like that, using pictures and like little characters that are funny. That author, Benji Schoendorf, that I mentioned earlier, he has a matrix that he does with kids, and he has these 2 little characters that he uses to represent the away side and the toward side, and it's really great. I do a matrix with kids when I need to, that is a slingshot. So I draw like a slingshot image, you know, like a Y shaped with a slingshot, and I do the matrix behind the slingshot. And I have a way of doing that with children, and I actually have a video of that on the internet, which I can send to you. It's on YouTube, but you may be able to find it if you just Google ACT matrix with kids. And it's a way that I've done it with children in the past. Obviously, you just want to tailor the language down. So toward and away might become close and far, or something like that. The one thing that I can tell you about adolescents is when you're working with adolescents, that circle in the middle, when you do that final step of who gets to choose who and what is important to you, adolescents get tripped up on that section. So almost without fail, my teenage clients will say, my parents choose what's important to me, or my teachers choose what's important to me, right? And then on the other side, who is the person that can experience all that stuff and notice all the things that you're experiencing? Adolescents almost always will say, my friends can notice all these things that I'm experiencing, or my parents can notice all the things that I'm experiencing. Okay, fine. And then the upper quadrants, you know, who is in charge of your hands and your feet? Well, a lot of times adolescents don't feel like they're in charge of their hands and their feet. So that part needs some adaptation there, because it doesn't really work as smoothly with adolescents. But basically what you're trying to do is you're just trying to find ways to empower them, and to actually let them know, of course the people that are closest to you can tell when you're upset. You know, of course your best friend knows when you're feeling depressed. That's because they're so close to you, right? They're so close to you. And you can do some exploration on like, yeah, you're right. Your parents do, you know, have a lot to say about who and what is important to you, and your teachers too. What does that mean? You know, what does that mean for you as a person who's developing and trying to become an independent, you know, member of society? How do you feel about that? So it's just extra to explore with that age. But it definitely does work. You just have to kind of stay on your feet a little bit, because adolescents and children are always going to keep you on your toes in that work. Yeah, Chris is asking, high functioning client with a complaint of sense of meaninglessness and not feeling they can be agent in a sick society. Yeah. Actually, for there, I would start with values work, because there's something really important about that they're trying to get across, but I don't know if they're actually getting it across, and I don't know if they're actually aware of it. Like there's some really cool values wrapped up in that idea of like society is sick, and I can't be an agent in my own life in this world, in this capitalistic world. There are some beautiful values in there that you can kind of dig for, and once those values are clarified, the other parts of the work should start to kind of unravel for you, or they'll open up for you. I think if you try to start with diffusion and kind of like, okay, that's a thought that you're having, whatever, I think that's going to kind of bounce off of that client. They're just going to be like, yeah, whatever. So I might try to really dig into, what is it that really matters? Why? What is it that's really important, and what do they deeply value? Again, sorry to keep tooting my own horn, but if you go to my website, theactmatrix.com, I do have a matrix specifically for like values work. I've done several different adaptations of the matrix for different issues and different ways of working. The one that I showed you today is just simply the most basic form of the matrix, and it's my intake protocol. But I do have a matrix solely for like uncovering values, which he may find useful. Alrighty, guys, we're about up on time. Thank you very much for being so participatory. I really enjoyed getting to see y'all's comments in the chat. Don't hesitate to reach out via email anytime. I'm always happy to talk or point you in the right direction. Please have a good rest of the evening and stay safe. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jake. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. The question from Chris, okay, is it a copy of? You have a question? Okay, never mind. I'm sorry about that.
The PowerPoint. I will.
PowerPoint. Okay, we sent it earlier.
I will send Estelle the final version of the PowerPoint, so maybe she can resend it to everybody. If sure, not, just you can email me and I'll send it to you.
Please, yes. Would you mind doing that? Sorry. Would you mind doing that, Jake, so I can send it to everyone? So, and also we can have a copy of it.
I'll send it to you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, everyone. The course evaluation has been sent. Once you completed that, we will email your certificate. Please give us at least 24 hours to process that for you. If you did not receive the course evaluation, you may check your junk mail or your spam folder. And or if it's not there,